have not actually moved the needle particularly fast. And as I said in the beginning, we still have 1 billion users of tobacco worldwide, 8 million people dying every year of tobacco products. Yet we have with us the capability to introduce a mixture of the reduced risk products I'm mentioning, and I would add better diagnosis and treatment.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Actionable ESG Talks series brought to you by AKFI Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry consortium committed to bridging the gap between ESG sustainability and digital transformation. I'm the co-host Isabella, here with Manuel, another co-host, executive director at the AKFI, and our special guest today, and I think it's our first official invite to our previous guest. Thank you for joining us again, Derek. You're the first one, I think, coming back officially. Yeah, we keep saying we'll invite people back for another one because there's a lot to follow up. And Derek is the first one, right? Well, if I remember right. I don't think we have
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Derek, for joining us again. And hopefully we'll have many other opportunities to talk on the record.
Well, it's a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's very special and super happy to see you here again, Derek, as an old friend. And we have a different topic to catch up this time. And before we started, a little bit to those who haven't watched our first episode of yours yet, Derek has several appointment throughout his career, including founder and former president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, senior vice president of global health and agriculture policy at PepsiCo, professor of global health at Yale University, executive director for non-communicable diseases and mental health at TED World Health Organization, where he directed the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the Global Strategy on Diet and Physical Activity. And he also served several advisory boards, including those of the Clinton Global Initiative, the World Economic Forum, and so on. Thank you very much, Derek. You look great. Love your background. So sustainable. And let's get the conversation started. Same as the last time, we always open up with a broad question to hear what are your thoughts on the current state on sustainability, ESG, and digital transformation, and this time on the tobacco industry.
Well, thanks, Isabella, and I say lovely to be with you and Manuel. I think the messages you're trying to get out have never been more needed. Obviously, I'm sitting in the US where ESG is under attack in the highest level of political office of the land. And in fact, the upcoming presidential election in 2024 may very well land up having discussions around ESG as one of the issues. One would have never thought that. So to your question, I think at this stage, it's worthwhile reflecting that the World Health Assembly of the WHO actually just concluded today their annual meeting. And if I was to think about from the health point of view and the sustainability aspect related to health, what I take away is the fact that the overall trends in health got substantially worse during the pandemic, particularly those related to chronic diseases and mental health. We might say that the long-term prospects for mental health are not looking good. And that has a profound impact on, obviously, individual lives, but also has a big impact on business, productivity, retention, quality of life at work. And so when I think of, what is some of the big issues, that is one. The second one is my favorite topic, obviously, of trying to end smoking. And there again, the trends are not looking great. We have over 1 billion people in the world who are still consuming toxic combustible cigarettes or smokeless products, particularly in South Asia. And the consequence is 8 million premature deaths worldwide. I feel that the interventions and the policy proposals by the governments that were discussed over the last week are simply not fit for purpose. They're not going to give us the sense of urgency to get on track, both for mental health and physical health, particularly those issues related to tobacco, and I might add physical activity as well. And I think that in time, these should emerge as being higher on the agenda of people involved in ESG. I've long felt that the S, the social, which is where health is hidden, needs to either have its own letter, or at least needs to be taken substantially more seriously, given that in the end, health is one of the most powerful determinants of economic growth, economic development, happiness, prosperity, and so on.
That's a great start, Derek. And as you mentioned, there are multiple trends, and after the COVID and the lockdowns and so on, most of these trends seem to reverse from, reducing the use of tobacco, reducing the pressure on agriculture, to they reverse course, and now it looks like we have to start serious work again. And one of the areas where tobacco intersects with food supply, because as you mentioned, there are reports showing the negative effect of cultivating tobacco. So any insights on this part of the industry? One of the trends you didn't mention, it's actually famine is rising again. Subnutrition is rising again. So please.
Yes, and in many ways, that question intersects with so many of my past work, both on tobacco, food, and agriculture at PepsiCo and later at the World Economic Forum. And I do think you're right. I think we are on the edge of what's going to be a worsening food crisis for the next decade. Of course, the invasion by Russia of Ukraine has also taken a lot of strain. But let me get to the tobacco and food issue. I was the first and maybe only person with the Minister of Health of Zimbabwe who in 1993 convened a meeting in Harare exactly on this topic and other aspects of tobacco control. Unlike most tobacco meetings, we invited the farmers and we invited the public health people to have a dialogue about how you can balance, on the one hand, the fact that success for health in tobacco means less tobacco growing, less livelihood for tobacco farmers. And at the time, the tobacco industry was very much behind pushing the farmers' interests as being a reason that we should slow down the efforts to try and reduce smoking, knowing that it would have an effect. At the time, and remember this was 1993 in Harare, home of a lot of the major tobacco growing folk. Mugabe was the president at the time, and despite that, we got the go-ahead to hold this meeting. For me, the most important insight I got was by the Malawi head of agriculture, who said that he's a farmer first, a tobacco farmer second. What he was saying was that give me alternatives. I'm growing tobacco because the price support from the industry is far better than for any other crop. The availability of markets and the assurance of a stable price is far better from the tobacco industry than other crops. Give me other crops and I'll make the transition. And that stayed at the back of my mind for many years, and we made very little progress. When I started the foundation, I argued very strongly, and we succeeded, in having a focus on Malawi as now being at the core of many of these issues. A poorish country trying to rise out of poverty, trying to address economic growth, one with a deep dependence for a century on tobacco growing, going back to a lot of the support from the British and the British American tobacco folk and all the other companies over time. And the project that was started probably now 5 years ago is doing very well, explicitly set out to say, how do we transition tobacco farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, into higher yielding crops, and not just crops, but also recognizing that certainly my view and many people was that you'd want the children, and particularly the daughters of today's tobacco farmers, to be involved in high technology, high yielding jobs, and not just destined to remain on the land where the pricing will always be an issue. So, I mean, I think this has been an issue that has been kept quietly off the table until the demand for tobacco started going down. And of course, once it goes down, the purchase, the value for the farmer is going down. There are many alternatives that could be looked at across the crop range. We know that there are a wide range of initiatives involving intensive vegetable production in greenhouses and so on, doing very well. But as I said, the essence still remains that the price support from the industry has been better than many other industries helping people make the transition. From the consumer side, from the tobacco user side, I think the movement that we've seen towards reduced risk products, I'm talking about safer forms of nicotine, particularly e-cigarettes, and we can talk about some of the contentious things that get raised. Nicotine pouches do not require us theoretically or practically to use any tobacco plants. So a vast percentage of the greenhouse gas emissions in the tobacco value chain come from tobacco growing, tobacco manufacture, curing, when you actually prepare the tobacco, moving it around, the processing of it, extracting the nicotine, all of that could be eliminated if you actually transition to green chemistry-driven synthetic nicotine. And I'm seeing that happening to a great extent. There's some companies like that, like Xanaprima, which have perfected an approach to green chemistry that actually has virtually negligible effect on the environment. Negligible compared to the massive loss of greenhouse gases, land use, the opportunity cost of growing food that come along with plants. We need the companies to take up this as well and start their own transition. And we're seeing it in some of them. Remember that for decades, of course, for a century, many of these companies have built a very strong relationship with the tobacco farming community. And the pricing of that tobacco farm, if you go to a place like Malawi, a tobacco farmer may be doing marginally better than their neighbor who's not growing tobacco, but it still hasn't lifted the country out of poverty. It still hasn't lowered the levels of undernutrition. So a lot of the promises over the decades that you as the farmer stick with us, you'll do well, they've survived and they've been able to live at the borderline of survival, but they've hardly thrived and the economy has hardly been boosted through the investments. So it's a complex issue. And I think in so many of the ESG issues, there are going to be winners and losers as one makes progress. The losers in the end will always be the smallholder farmer, and I'm sure it occurs in other sectors. And that's why specific, careful thought needs to be given about how you're transitioning. And we should not allow a holdup on the transition away from the toxic combustibles and smokeless products to be held up on the grounds that farmers will be out of work. We need to think about how we put them to work. And we've seen that in many other sectors, including, for example, the transport sector, where nobody is arguing strongly for the continuation of the people who make the internal combustion engine, who are all losing their jobs as we move towards electrics. Rather, they're looking at how you retrain them for a better opportunity, for a higher paying opportunity. And that's the dilemma we face. And I think the ESG signals of saying that it's more desirable to move from a tobacco plant-based approach to a synthetic nicotine approach. It's a win for health, it's a win for the environment, and it's a win for the consumer. But recognize this must take time, and we need support to actually help the transition happen without massive disruption to the smallholder farmer.
Very, very clear. And going back to synthetic nicotine, and I'm thinking more in terms of the tobacco industry, not the farming part. Because farming, as you said, it's hard to move it from subsistence to really be a thriving industry. If we look at in general at the farming in the Western world, it's mechanized, automated. Self-driving tractors are now a staple in U.S. and the European community. So we see automation going into farming in that sense. But going back to synthetic nicotine, uh, is there an impact on the tobacco industry? Is it cheaper to produce and distribute, probably, and less harmless, of course?
Yeah, I think like with all new technologies, the use of synthetic nicotine started off at a price point that was much higher than the plant-derived product. But as volumes grow and as the demand increases and efficiency improves, we're seeing the pricing come down to be now competitive. So I think that, there's several parts. The industry's now become much more complex than it was in the past. It used to be dominated by a few major multinationals and the Chinese state monopoly. Well, we've now got some younger, smaller players who are really saying the future lies in clean nicotine, both for medicinal purposes as well as recreational purposes. So a US-based company like Smood has committed totally to ESG goals in everything it does, using synthetic nicotine, not plant-based, focusing on recyclability and biodegradability of the actual products that they produce. I can see that there are other companies like Ignite, another US company with a big footprint worldwide, has been very clear. It sees the value of synthetic nicotine for the consumer, but also for the environment. And I think I remind a lot of people, whereas the bigger companies are starting to go in that direction. And remember that if you take the really big ones, Philip Morris is now getting over a third of their revenue from nicotine-based products and not from combustible cigarette. When they acquired Swedish Match, this actually went up a bit. My hope for them and for companies like BAT, who are catching up pretty fast, at maybe 15%, is that as they start putting out e-cigarettes with high quality and standards, as they use nicotine pouches, and as the pharmaceutical industry hopefully gears up nicotine replacement therapy, they would commit to make sure that over time they're only going to use synthetic nicotine. It eliminates the environmental issues. It gives a better impact in terms of health, and it gives an assurance of traceability. And I think that is probably what's going to happen.
Well, it's very interesting, and I can see this intersection between technology, ESG, and creating not a smoke-free environment as much as you said. Although I don't know if smoke-free is combustible or not. That's a technical question. But creating an environment where people still can enjoy the products and companies still can be in business, as you mentioned about Philip Morris. So I see in some way a parallel with other industries transitioning from technologies that are affecting the people, affecting the environment, to technologies that are less impactful. And this is very encouraging to me.
Yeah, well, I think being in the food sector for a number of years, I've seen many analogies. I mean, as we start moving as food products, the demand for healthier food products are also the demand for environmentally sustainable products. We're seeing the rise of the demand for a wide range of agricultural practices that rely less on heavy intensity greenhouse gas, water use, land use patterns. That basically means a shift out of a very heavy meat-based culture to more of a plant-based one, a greater focus on what's been done. And these things don't happen overnight. I think that's the other point. It often takes a long period of time. The one thing I think I learned in the food period that I was there was how that the consumer is shifting quite rapidly, and the demand for eating healthy is probably now equivalent to the demand for eating environmentally sustainably. And I get a sense that there are different groups of consumers. I lump them into three big camps. Those who are moving towards healthier products because they're concerned about their own health or the health of their children. That may be, I don't know, maybe a third. But there's another third And that's the third who are doing this because they are really concerned about the next generation and the quality of the environment. And they are thinking less about the health benefits of, say, a sustainable agriculture produced product on the food shelf. That's the sort of area where Whole Foods has taken off on and played particularly to the environmental benefits. They represent maybe also another third. And the final third are those who are kind of indifferent or really focusing primarily on taste, convenience, and price, which has been the traditional group. Probably still a much larger percentage of the population in many of the parts of the world where incomes are lower. But if we think about this, it suggests that the long-term goal of marketing of healthy products and environmental products needs to be better integrated, so that when we think of the food products today in the US, we have all this labeling for salt and sugar and fat, and I don't know who reads the labels, but we don't have a stamp to say whether this meets environmental standards, the best environmental standards. And obviously the companies put their own marketing on, and they say natural or gluten-free or whatever they want to say. But we really need to think about how you'd be able to signal to the consumer, this is better for health and this is better for the environment. I think that would accelerate the transition. The same now happens in some of the newer reduced risk tobacco products. They are going to be better for your health because they're going to be mainly nicotine, and better for the environment because they take all of the plant negatives and the concerns about recyclability and the poor quality of recyclability. And I suspect it'll attract a class of consumer who's not really moving off a combustible cigarette for their own health as much as maybe other factors, concern about the environment, concern about their loved ones and people around them. So how one twins the messages around health and the environment in marketing and in packaging and in messaging, I think is going to be a great opportunity for the future.
And, on a little bit of a data points, I've seen data points saying that there are between 4,000 and 7,000 different chemicals and products that are used in cigarettes. And for instance, the filters of the combustion cigarettes, which are still the majority, if I understand correctly, they are not biodegradable. They end up in landfills. And the claim is actually that the tobacco industry is not made responsible for recycling as much as other industries are made responsible these days. Right to repair, recycling, shipping with recycling, information on the package and so on, disassembly. So it seems that the industry would have to catch up as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've always known for many decades proliferation of cigarette butts, and of course there's plastic and plastic-related substances in them that make it very difficult in landfill. If you think back to another industry, Nespresso, when it started its Nespresso pods, I had to face the same issue. There was an aluminium component, there was coffee granules left, also with high degrees of problems. But I think they've built a very impressive recycling culture and capability in many of the markets around the world. I think we could learn a lot about that, not for the cigarette butt issue, because I think that's really going to require a lot more effort, but for some of the newer disposable vape products, particularly the batteries, the electronics, and to think about how we can ensure that recyclability becomes easy. Biodegradability should become a hallmark of what a good company does, so that while they've taken out the plant-based concerns, they also start addressing a lot of the hardware-related issues, which are new challenges. But they're not new challenges outside of the tobacco industry. We've had decades now of how you deal with electronic waste, how you deal with batteries, how you deal with many of the plastic components and find recyclable or biodegradable alternatives. I've seen a lot of companies, some based in China, some based here, some based in Europe, all thinking deeply about this, but we haven't yet got norms and standards for the industry that could guide them. And the ESG world has been slow to say, how can they adapt some of their measures to pick this up far better?
in the interest of time, I'll turn very quickly to Isabella, but European standard seems to be much more advanced in terms of the responsibilities. I call them the brands because this is what the public knows, and responsibility for the supply chain, for the entire supply chain. And one surprising factor is that we think of regulations really being applicable to public companies. But since the supply chain intertwines public and private companies, once you make the public company responsible for all the reporting chain, it involves the entire supply chain, it involves private companies. And I don't know specifically it applies to the tobacco industry, but I think it's included in that. It includes all the multinationals, and the industries are multinational in the case of cigarettes. Uh, well, we started by inviting you for the second time, and now is the time to launch an invitation for a follow up. But I'd like to turn to Isabella for a final question, and definitely we'll be glad to see you soon again. Isabella.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Derek. You mentioned a little bit during your talk about my final thoughts on the future of tobacco industry, considering the trends in ESG financing and sustainability. Would you please give us a summary wrapped up for our audience to take away today?
I think for me, the biggest thought that I always have at the back of my mind goes back to my South Africa roots. During the President Mbeki period, you may recall that he failed to allow antiretrovirals for AIDS in South Africa, due to a whole lot of reasons we won't go into. The consequence was measured by the economists, and 350,000 people died as a result of that bad policy. We're now sitting on perhaps even a worse bad policy, and that is the failure of the World Health Organization and the leading health players to accept that reduced risk products, so-called harm reduction, could save more lives than any intervention that we know about in public health. My own estimates suggest that over the period of about 2025 to 2060, we predict that there will be deaths occurring at about 6.5 million a year over that entire period. We could cut that to 3 million if we accelerated access through better regulations, through better information, and through allowing companies to do what they do best, get out there, sell their stuff, obviously responsibly and carefully to adults only. But if you did that, you would save the lives of over 3 million people who would needlessly die before their death, before they should die, over the course of many decades, adding up to probably 100 million premature deaths. The numbers are kind of staggering. And so the question is, if this is all so preventable, why are we not doing more to prevent? And the answer lies, I think, in old thinking. 20 years ago, we didn't have these technologies. And people are trapped in the approach that the only way to tackle the tobacco problem is the tried and tested way that worked particularly well in Europe: tax, advertising bans, controls on smoking in public places, all of which are good. But the result of those have not actually moved the needle particularly fast. And as I said in the beginning, we still have 1 billion users of tobacco worldwide, 8 million people dying every year of tobacco products. Yet we have with us the capability to introduce a mixture of the reduced risk products I'm mentioning, and I would add better diagnosis and treatment for many of the diseases people die of. If we did that, we would have a huge benefit and impact on public health. Is that likely? I remain an optimist, and I see what's happening in countries like the UK, the US FDA, New Zealand, Canada, recently Pakistan, a range of countries around the world, the UAE, where governments are getting it, that this is good for their people. This is good for the health of the population. This is what's actually going to save lives. And looking at the evidence and saying the science is kind of obvious by now. It's very clear. Reduced risk products save lives, many more than anything else.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek.
I hope we can relay the message to as many people as we can and make maybe a small contribution, but you really connected ESG, sustainability, technologies, and really how we can make this planet better by
Thank you.
not shortening the lives of so many people.
Yeah, by creating less, not more.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Really appreciate it, Derek. And thank you all to our audience for tuning in. Make sure you're joining us every week for a new episode of AKFI's Actionable ESG Talks series, where you can gain new perspective on how to mitigate risk and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation. Thank you all again. Until the next week. Goodbye for now. Bye, Manuel. Bye, Derek.
Bye, Derek. Bye, Isabella. Thank you both.